Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a good night's sleep and you're awake after this very impressive, though at the end very cold Müller-Reuth yesterday. We have a very interesting program today. Maybe one issue at the very beginning, somebody forgot his or her sunglasses in the bus. So if this is you, please approach us and we will return it to you. Another thing we would like to announce is that we have reached 89 participants. Yeah, we are growing. Still have to register today, but nevertheless, I think we can announce this. I think it's even now at 23 countries. I also would like to announce that we would like to take a family picture of all of you. Just regarding the organization, we will have a keynote with Andy van Dam. Afterwards, we will have a few words about the poster session. And after that, so when you leave this room, you just go outside and there will be a picture taken from above. So just follow me basically, but do not take a coffee, but let's take the picture first. So now it's my pleasure to hand over the mic to David Millard, who will introduce Andy van Dam for you.
Thank you, Klaus. Yes, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second keynote session of the conference. So this morning I'm delighted to present or to introduce someone who I think deserves to be called one of the originators of our field. Andy van Dam was one of the co-founders of computer science at Brown University, and probably most importantly for us, he was involved in the 60s in the development of the very first hypertext systems there. Also of relevance, given that this is the 30th hypertext conference, is the fact that he gave one of the keynotes at the very first hypertext conferences in 1987. Now, the text for that keynote is actually still online. So last night I had a little read of it, and I was very struck by the first sentence, which I'm going to repeat to you now. He said, "I'm a Johnny-come-lately to hypertext. I didn't get started until 1967." Which I think doesn't give much hope to the rest of us. But he's also made tremendous contributions in the area of graphics and animation, and was one of the co-founders of the organization that went on to become ACMHT. And I hope this rumor is true, but I understand that he was such an inspiration to the people in that field that when they founded Pixar, the character of Andy in Toy Story is named after him. Is that correct? It's a good urban legend, yeah. Well, I think that inspiring those people to make those movies was another great contribution. So in any case, I'm very honored to present to you this morning Professor Andy van Dam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me, especially Klaus, and especially this guy, who is an AV wizard, and I could not have done this presentation without him. So I'm going to take you on a kind of personalized journey, and I'll tell you what I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But while I'm thanking people, here's a long list of people, and you'll recognize some of them. For example, the feedback folks who really helped me put this pitch together: Klaus, Mark Bernstein, read it very closely. Dick Bultman dug in and helped me revise slides and gave me additional information, as did Norm Meyerowitz. And I even got some really valuable input from another person I've been close to for many years, who will be familiar to people in the social media arena, Dana Boyd, who writes extensively about the impact of social media on society, especially teenagers. Well, what I want to thank these people for in particular is that it gave me a chance to go back to my roots and the roots of multiple other people, some in this room, and sort of try to catch up with the field a bit because, frankly, I'll confess this to you, I stopped attending the conferences and I concentrated on what I started my career with, which is interactive computer graphics, and I kept having my students, my undergraduates in particular, work on systems, but hypertext systems, but it was kind of a sideline for me. So this brought me back into the mindset, and I've really enjoyed doing a deep dive. Still too superficial for my taste. There's so many good foundational papers that need to be read. But I thought I'd start things off by asking this rhetorical question. Are we done yet? This statement, declare victory and go home, came from one of the first senators in America who decided that the Vietnam War was unwinnable, and this was his way, essentially, of saying, let's get out of here. Well, is it time for us to get out of the hypertext field? Are we done? Norm Meyerowitz said, this would be a good alternate title. Many people think we are done because the web is here, and to them, that represents hypertext. I'll have more to say about the fact that that is, of course, misguided, and this audience especially knows that's true. The web is a great thing, but it's not the beginning, and it's certainly not the end. We have a whole agenda ahead of us that will keep us busy. So I'm going to make this rather a personalized telling of the hypertext story. And I'm going to weave a number of themes together. Ted Nelson coined this nice word, intertwined in English. And what's interesting about the way the conference has evolved since the time I was really active in it is that hypertext and social media have at least been joined, if not fused. And to me, they're just different aspects of the notion of connectivity. In hypertext, we connect content. In social media, through content, we connect people. So everything is about connection and associations, and that works very well together. So this personal journey for me started back in the Stone Age. I'm a dinosaur. I freely admit it. And the joy of that is that I've seen the field evolve from not even being a field to being the mainstream field today that is driving the economy and society in general, both for good and for bad. This was my world. It was the world of punched cards, and I did my PhD dissertation using the one and only computer at the University of Pennsylvania. I didn't quite finish my thesis, I confess, and joined Brown University with an unfinished PhD dissertation and a program that was in process. So imagine this, at least once a month, I took an airplane, flew 300 miles from Providence, Rhode Island to Philadelphia, where I had a half-hour slot on that mainframe from 2 to 2:30 in the morning and could use it as my personal computer. Can you imagine flying to get access to a computer? That's what it was. I had decks of cards. That was my life. This is a card I wrote on to introduce Bill Buxton, in case you were trying to decode it. My life changed because I saw this movie in about 1964. I'd been working in information retrieval, and here I saw man-machine interaction, as it was called back then. Human-computer interaction is what we call it now. How many of you have seen the Sketchpad movie? Not enough. It's online. See it, and you'll see many of the ideas that we still use today. For example, having computers infer intent when I'm drawing on the screen. That's still a very young field, subfield, I would say. The beginnings of object-oriented programming are found in Sketchpad, so I still show this movie in my introductory lecture in my computer graphics course because it is still relevant. He wanted to use man-machine communication to communicate in picture language, and we do that completely naturally these days because we use our GUIs. This was the first formal paper I wrote, computer-driven displays and their use in man-machine interaction. So for me, from the get-go, I wanted to get out of the punch card business, which was batch processing, 1 or 2 runs a day, to you're in intimate communication with a computer, and preferably in picture language. So my worldview, which I'm going to talk about today, will differ from that of everybody else in the audience. This is a slice through a hypersolid in many, many different dimensions. This happens to be my personal slice. I came, as I said, from this world of information retrieval, which was batch, and that was part of the larger circle of information management. How do we curate information? How do we store it so that we can access it conveniently, and so on. And then when I ran into Ted Nelson at the Spring Joint Computer Conference in 1967, and he told me about this nutso idea of linking and doing things interactively, I immediately saw the potential of it and said, yeah, that's a very good way of thinking about it. So we, as far as I'm concerned, are very much part of information management, but very quickly, through TED and other people, I also saw the potential of this being a new medium in and of itself, quite apart from the tools for creating and navigating it. And so there's a big intersection with creative writing and creative expression, and hypertext kind of overlaps both of these. I still am on the information management of things. Now, I have a couple of references here. This idea of nonlinearity, which Ted and Doug, to a lesser extent, pushed, had lots of beginnings in more traditional media. Nabokov's Pale Fire, which Ted told me about and which I tried to read. It's not an easy read. There are other attempts to do that. Even Burroughs' Naked Lunch can be seen as a kind of out-of-control hypertext. For other media, most people have never heard of this, but at the Montreal World Fair Expo in '67, there was an interactive movie. The audience voted on which branch to take next. And Dick, over breakfast, Dick Bolterman told me about some modern attempts to kind of mimic that. In 1969, I was invited by the television station in Boston to do a live program with my students. I worked with undergraduates at that time and still today, and talk about both what hypertext is and how it could be used as a new medium for expression. So we sort of thought about how it could be used for newspaper writing and forecast something that looks a lot like the web with its embedded links, but also its use in hyperfiction and so on, all speculative and based on these earlier antecedents. So it was interesting to kind of go off in that direction, but I haven't really pursued it since then. So I am not advancing. Okay, back into information management, which is my roots. A very old idea, as I'll show you, and it's reflected in the mission statement of any number of companies today, for example, in Google's. So I was delighted to see how much emphasis Klaus wanted to have in this conference on history, and he himself was very good in his papers about referring to earlier work and trying to contextualize it. So I'm going to do it from my personal point of view for just a little bit and talk about early pioneers. Saying information management, getting your hands around the world's information, is a very ancient idea. The Library of Alexandria was the earliest example that I know of really formalizing the gathering and the examining of information of all kinds. A person that most people have never heard of, even in this field, is Paul Otlet. How many people know who he was and what he did? See, now that's a way better number than you find in any other audience, and it's still less than a third of you. So a little bit about this genius, unrecognized, unfortunately. He also had this mission of gathering, indexing, and making accessible all the world's information. And you see these humongous file cabinets and people trying to organize that information. The Nazis destroyed it, and it was rebuilt, and it was based on index cards, but very deep indexing. It was really an amazing system. And not only did he think about indexing the world's information, but he was very concerned about how you distribute that information. Look at these drawings from his writings. On the bottom left, you will see that there is a lecturer delivering a lecture to remote participants. And he thought about the promise of new communication media, including the beginnings of television, which were just beginning to emerge at that time. Look at the diagram on the right. What do you see? That's the internet, folks. Analog, to be sure, but this idea of connecting people and resources is a very old idea, and it can be found in Otlet's writings. Amazing. Another, yes? Thank you, Dick. Yes, I'll make this talk available, and I have references in the comments section so that you can follow some of these pointers. Another person that almost nobody knows anything about is Emanuel Goldberg, and he was very high up in the Zeiss organization. And he based his ideas on how to store and retrieve information on microfilm, an analog technology, a technology that I grew up with, by the way. That's how you read old newspapers on microfilm readers. You still can in many libraries. And he invented a gadget that is the precursor to Bush's Memex, which I'll talk about in a moment. He patented it, and his invention was so complete that Bush, who had a much more expansive vision even than Goldberg did, was unable to patent it. So if you look at these drawings, it's not important that you decode them. I just want you to know that on the left bottom here, let's see if I can use the pen again. Over here, it's not just pieces of microfilm, there's also code that is stored with the microfilm, keys, tags, if you like, that would allow retrieval. So it's a retrieval mechanism, and it was mimicked in this illustration that Bush approved in the Landmark article, As We May Think. How many people have read it? Okay, that's good. Everybody needs to read it and reread it about once a year before you go to a conference, because you'll see many, many of the ideas that we build out today originated there. It's also a microfilm device with tags and annotations, but as we know, Bush, in As We May Think, thought deeply about how information is connected, how ideas are associated. I'll come back to him in just a moment. I mentioned that I grew up in the information retrieval area and with cards. How many people have ever seen this aperture card in the top left? Very few of you. Okay. Card readers, card printers, but in the middle, this little cutout with a piece of 35 millimeter microfilm so that you could have dense storage for images, but codes that would allow computer retrieval. On the right-hand side was what was thought to be the solution to the information density problem, which was essentially infinite grain, no grain at all, grainless, particular kind of microfilm, photochromic. It's in my transition sunglasses. Photochromic glass will turn with the amount of light that it receives from transparent to opaque. But you could also use it as a storage medium, and the entire King James version of the Bible, 1,200 pages, fit on this tiny little piece of microfilm, which you read under a microscope. And I thought that's going to be the solution for storing the world's information, because you can stick that little bit of microfilm in a card, and then you can use computer techniques to retrieve things. So that was the souvenir handed out in the World's Fair in the early 60s. Okay, there are other old inventions in the print medium that predate what we do with hypertext today. Threaded discussions with pictures in the Talmud, starting in the 2nd century. And here I was in Morocco, and I was in a museum this past April, and I saw this gorgeous illustrated interpretation of the Quran, which is called a Hadith. Same thing, marginalia. So, explication du texte. Fabulous. And here's the King James Version. They just discovered this catalog of all works that were available in print medium. It's here just for fun so that you know it exists. One of the things that I always found fascinating is this sketch of what a reading machine would look like that would give you essentially a window manager with multiple viewports in which you could have various manuscripts at your fingertips instantly. And Mark wrote me that he actually saw an implementation of this in Prague, in a museum. So Prague is close. You can all go there. I wish I could see this thing. It was great, right? It's fabulous, a reading machine. By the way, this notion of nested, threaded discussion in print survives even today in David Wallace's work, and other people do it as well. You use layout, you use colors, you use fonts, and so on to indicate the enrichment. Back to Bush. So I'm just going to show you a few of the quotes that inspire our community. Associative memory. Turns out I did my PhD with a simulated form of associative memory called multi-list, invented by my faculty advisors. So I was very familiar with the idea of, in our heads, we do parallel processing. We don't do sequential lookup, and items that are associated semantically somehow are retrieved together. So the MEMEX build out on that idea, and Bush talked about associative trails where you jump around from destination to destination, connecting things that belong together. Building a trail of many items, main trails, side trails. Think of walking in a beautiful forest where trails have been blazed for you, and you come to branch points and can choose, or there can be, with signs, a guided tour that takes you through the most interesting points. Trails do not fade. New forms of encyclopedia. Wikipedia you could think of as an example of that, with a mesh of associative trails. And then he forecast the profession of trailblazers, people who will make these things, and I'll come back to how difficult that is, how hard the authoring problem remains even today. So Bush has a lot of lovely stuff, and it was made real in the first instance by this guy who read Bush's article when he was in the Navy during the war, and afterwards, Doug Engelbart. So I want to just go back and tell you about having seen the mother of all demos, a reference to the war in Iraq, and the mother of all demos probably will never be repeated in terms of its scope and splendid execution. So he walked into this auditorium, and there was this huge screen with real-time projection. I'd never seen anything like that. Nobody in the audience had either. And there, sort of Moses-like, was the small inset of Doug himself at the control, and he spoke ex cathedra to you as he ran through the demo with his collaborators 30 miles away in Menlo Park. So what do we want to remember this demo and the system for? I've given a small outline of those things. It was the first time I had seen interactive authoring and reading on screens besides what we had done at Brown ourselves without really knowing about this system. He showed outline processing, which we still use today, with statements in an outline form that you could align and summarize links between them. And he was sort of the first person to give you this idea that you could fly and navigate through information space, and he did it live for us. He used multiple windows. He used, for the first time, bimanual operation, mouse in the dominant hand on the right, and then moding the mouse with his left hand with a keyboard. One of the little things that nobody thinks about today, but we hadn't done it, and I don't know if anybody had thought of it before. Links shouldn't be buried as hidden structure. They should be human readable. You should be able to copy and paste them and put them in mail and so on. And of course, we do that with URLs today. It was real time. He was working with people who were remote, doing collaborative editing, chalk passing protocol. Now it's my turn, now it's your turn, and we can both see each other's method. It's each other's markup and edits. Think Google Docs today. Another thing that's really important is he was an architect of systems and thought about tool building in a disciplined way, and the system itself was constructed as a set of components that would work together, and that is a theme we come back to when we talk, for example, about component-based hypertexts, open hypertext systems componentized so that you can leverage the individual pieces. He also was the first to really think about the impact on his little group, big group, I should say, which he called the bootstrap community. Now, for a foreign audience, the idea of bootstrapping is not natural. It started out probably with Baron von Munchausen's tales, where he rescues himself from a swamp by pulling himself up by his hair. That was translated in 18th century British literature to the impossible feat of putting yourself on your horse by pulling up on your bootstraps. So it was a satire of somebody trying to perform an impossible task. But in the 20th century in America, it got inverted, and it was basically help yourself by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and it became a possible task, not an impossible task. Self-sufficiency. It survived in the computer age through something called the bootstrap loader, a little program that you keyed in, which would then load a larger loader, which then in turn would be the full loader that would load in the rest of the operating system. Bootstrapping became a term in the computer literature. And Doug meant that by using tools productively in your own group, you get your group to be more productive, build better tools, and you are in a virtuous build cycle. That's the bootstrap community. And his ultimate goal, which we'll come back to at the end of this talk, is he wanted people to be more productive so that their collective IQ would be raised. Human intellect augmentation was really what his tool building was all about. And he wanted to raise the IQ not just of himself or his immediate co-workers, but larger groups and indeed society as a whole. He had very big vision. Dick. I will come back to answer Dick's question, but the sneak preview is everybody was blown away and thought it was absolutely fantastic and nothing else happened. There was almost no further impact. People thought it was too far out and they were still working on their physical teletypes, hadn't even migrated to glass teletypes yet. So it sparked interest in a small, vigorous research community, but it didn't have impact on the computer field as a whole. Neither did Ted Nelson, although he turned a lot of people on to the idea of computing for the masses. He coined the word hypertext. Ted and Mark and I all share the distinction that we went to the same undergraduate college. I was a contemporary with Ted. So when I met him at this Spring Joint Computer Conference and he told me about this idea of hypertext, there were multiple ways in which that resonated. He was after modeling complexity with a medium that would support nonlinearity, stuff you can't print, non-sequential writing, and doing away with the tyranny of linearity or even hierarchy. Very important to understand that. You want more degrees of freedom, and that's what hypertext gives us. He has a very complete description in this 1966 proposal to a publishing company, and all of that is available online. And he lays out a number of functions that he wants in a system, and then he commuted to Brown University, where my undergraduates and I worked with him on the first hypertext system, which I'll talk about in just a second. But I want to finish with other things that he did. He very early on thought about authors and their intellectual property and how they get reimbursed in a world in which we repurpose snippets of their work and incorporate it in our own. And to this day, we really don't have a good system for doing that, except perhaps in music, where we can download songs if we pay a little bit for each one. He was really an amazing evangelist through his writings, and Computer Lib and Dream Machines are still fun to look at, and I recommend them to you. As I mentioned, he came to Brown and collaborated with us, asked us to implement a lot of functionality, some of which we were able to, some of which we were not. 1967 picture, one of my undergraduate students sitting at a screen with a light pen, think mouse, rearranging arbitrary strings of text, making links between regions of text in one to another. And the first demonstration vehicle, which Ted inspired, was a database of patents. This is an early drawing of what it looked like. You can see the mess of links, but there is structure. And it took a while to learn that structure. It wasn't that easy to navigate. And I'll come back to the notion that Mark in particular helped popularize of, you can't deal with a mass of spaghetti. You have to have some design patterns so that you kind of know what you're going to see before you get there. We continued working on a sequence of hypertext systems, which I won't take time to explain. I'll just mention their names. System Ted worked on and published with us, hypertext editing system in 67. 68, we started FRESS. I'll show you a video of what that looked like in just a moment. Electronic document system that Steve Feiner worked on, which was an adaptive hypertext. Intermedia that Norm Meyerowitz and his group worked on extensively for almost a decade. They were, at the beginning, all students who had come out of my graphics group had worked on various aspects of media and hypermedia. And essentially, I spun all that work off into the Institute for Research and Information and Scholarship, which Norm came to head after some time because I wanted to concentrate on 3D interactive graphics. So the hypermedia stuff moved into Iris, and Intermedia is their best known product. We commercialized electronic book technologies, where Steve DeRose, known to many of you, was chief scientist, and we were the first people to combine SGML and hyperlinks for commercial documentation of aircraft, for example. And then much, much later, and I'm going to demo it live, is the Touch Art Gallery. So we've had a sequence of systems, and I'm also going to show you what we're currently working on. Let me go back and talk to you about FRESS, which was used in a first online community experiment for teaching poetry. We created a database of about 700 different items: poetry, commentary on poetry, critiques, the student writings themselves, the instructor's comments on the student writings, other students reacting to the comments and enriching the hypertext. We had only a single graphics terminal, and it was used in turn, but it was the first online scholarly community from everything I can tell. System ran on a 370. It was called FRESS because it ate voraciously 128K of a 512K machine, and it ran a complete time-sharing system in that 128K, but it was begrudged. It used command line editing, and I'll show that to you. And here are some attributes. I'd rather show it to you than talk about it. Fine-grained, bidirectional linking, outline structure was optional a la NLS, and it had various kinds of view specs and display keywords so that you could tailor what the user would see next in an adaptive way. So answering Dick's question now, I'm going to show the system in just a moment, but I'll finish this slide. So we worked on this system starting in '67 with Hess and then moving to FRESS. And we worked on that for about a decade and used it in multiple courses and so on. Was it considered a legitimate area of research? The answer is a resounding no. My chairman at one point said to me, "You should really stop with this hypertext nonsense. That's not going to go anywhere. Do some serious work in computer science." Not kidding. I had to beg for money to be allowed to use the computer and to have the humanists who are using my system be allowed to use it for writing their books and teaching their courses. And at one point, I got into this huge fight with the vice president for finance, who was also the dean of engineering at the time. And he said, "I'm not going to give you any more money for this. You're wasting valuable computer times. Let them use typewriters. Let them eat cake." You get the transposition. And I basically fought him on the grounds that the computer was supposed to be for the use of the entire university, not just the engineers and scientists. And if he wasn't going to give me the money, then I was going to go public with the fact that he was discriminating. So he eventually backed out. But I'm just trying to give you a feeling for the fact that hypertext research was not respected, was considered a waste of computer resources. And indeed, this is a time when computer science, folks, wasn't even a field. There were many people who said anything that calls itself a science isn't. Political science was the classic example. Another chairman that I reported to 7 years later told me, computer science, that's just so much bathroom thinking. And I've programmed in Fortran. I know computer science. He was a very distinguished applied mathematician, but his sense of what computer science was that, it was not a real field. So we are all totally comfortable with the fact that computer science is the dominant field in science in so many ways and underlies the other sciences, and in fact, every field you can name. But that wasn't true in the 60s or 70s, and it had to grow over time. Okay, let me show you. Let's see, Daniel, can you help me out? I would like to show the FRESS video. So this ran on all terminals, including even typewriter terminals.
I'm David Duran.
Many of you know David Duran from High Time and his involvement in hypertext workshops. He was one of my students, as was Steve DeRose. Those of you in the back may want to move forward.
I'll be demonstrating the FRESS hypertext system. This is actual 40-year-old code from the final 1979 release of FRESS. It's running on an emulated mainframe under the Hercules 370 emulator. The display that we're going to be using is a modern program which emulates the functions of the original IMLAC microcomputer client. While even hard copy terminals were well supported by FRESS, the IMLAC used its vector scope and light pen to support multiple window editing and direct interaction. Watch the top line as FRESS commands were entered by a mix of typing and light pen interaction. We've made the modern client transparently support mouse scrolling and link following, so some of the interactions will feel more modern. There were some instant commands on the IMLAC using a menu, which we have not emulated. The file that we've got open here is a giant list of links to poems in the poetry database used in the experimental poetry course taught with FRESS. To follow a link or to activate a piece of hypertext content, I type the jump command. I can select a link that I'm interested in and hit return, and I go to the destination. Here you can see the italics, you can see the formatting, and we can see a bunch of things labeled %P. These are the PMUJs, PMUJs, the inverse links to the J links that we saw in the main file. Supported up to 7 different window formats. I'll show a few of them just for interest, and then I will pick the one that we're going to use for the rest of the demo. When you are in a multiple window mode like this, you could simply, when you selected a link, FRESS would find an unused window and put the information into it. Sometimes you wanted to direct a particular window to be filled with particular content, and if you wanted to do that, you could say jump to François Villon by the Swinburne and say put it in window 2, and it would get put into that particular place. So you had a lot of flexibility in how you handled your screen. I'm going to actually put that into window 1. We're back in the textbook, and I'm going to use the get label command. This lets me use a named bookmark to get to a particular location. And I'm going to go to the index of the book. This was typed in from a printed book by Josiah Strandberg for the course, and all of the index citations were turned into links. I have the ability to travel through the book via the index. And one thing that you can see is that the index entries tend to clutter the display, and they're not really, it's not usually that useful to go back to the index. So there were visibility commands in FRESS that could control which content was visible at which times. It was handled by keywords. What I've typed in, period view all, is a command macro, user macro, that would set the queries so that certain links would not be displayed. View inv would show the inverse links. So that's how you could hide and show content. You could also adjust the style of the display with view specs, an idea that came from Engelbart's NLS system. I'm going to switch my view specs to the edit mode, which shows much more complete information about everything. And one thing you notice here is lots of formatting codes. You can also see in these $signs, those are keywords for visibility on the links and the PMUJs. And in particular, you see that these PMUJs are tagged as inv. If I go to view all, turning off the inverse links, those vanish away. They're still there, they're effective, I could travel to them, but they're not visible. I'm going to set my view specs back to the normal mode using another command macro that was defined for the course, .imlac. What I'd like to look at right now is to show some editing. So I'm going to get file demo, and I'm going to put it in window 2.
So I have a bunch of videos time won't permit me to show here. I'd be delighted if anybody came up to me during the coffee break or lunch and said, I'd like to see some more, and show you various systems. Okay. After FRESS, as I said, I spun out the hypermedia work to IRIS, where Norm Meyerowitz and his team, undergraduates that had graduated and then became full-time members of the staff. And I'm not going to talk about intermedia today. There isn't time. Many of you know it. It improved on FRESS in a number of ways, came up with a bunch of new metaphors. He coined the term web for what we now understand as a web of related materials. And the idea of having multiple webs over the same set of materials fell out of that very naturally. Again, links are bidirectional, full text searching, visualizations of various kinds, templates, and so on. After intermedia came other things, including this commercialization in the electronic book technologies. And then skipping over a bunch of history, the most recent system that we implemented is called TAG, and it was chosen by the Nobel Foundation for a traveling exhibition that had both artifacts and this digital examination of Nobel's life, the will, the people he worked with, and on the right-hand side, a keyworded set of Nobel laureates, which you could query on a large touch-to-screen by name, by year, by field. You could find out how many people got 2 Nobel Prizes and so on. I'm going to show you just a little bit of the will. On top, I want you to look at the AIDS quilt, which is 22 acres of actual quilted materials that people made to commemorate victims of the AIDS epidemic. It is so large now, it has about 80,000 panels, that there is no place they can be physically laid out. What you see here on the National Mall in Washington is a subset. We have the whole thing digital, and you can pinch zoom your way in on a touch display to get to any individual panel. You can type in the name of someone and you'll go there and so on. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the Nobel will. It's a very simple closed hypermedia system. It ran in kiosk mode so that you never saw the computer. You just walked up and interacted with it. We'll switch sources and I'll go to my little Surface Pro and show you just a little bit of what this looked like. So you're looking at this large display and it says touch to explore. This is all the instruction that we gave the users. It was up in Singapore for 6 months and tens of thousands of people saw it. It never went down, I'm proud to say, and people seem to have fun working with it. So these are the directions, and I'm going to show you how the wheel works. There's this little slider here. Do you see me moving it? Okay, what's happening is we're taking the Swedish text, we're translating it on the left, that shows up in white, so that you can get a complete translation of this thing. And as I move the sliders, you'll see these links appearing where I can get additional information. So you can scroll your way through the will, and at times you will see that some red portion of the will is highlighted, and that typically coincides with we got some interesting information on this person in particular. So let's follow this link. We go to Georges Fehrenbach, who was a chemist, and we see that we can go to some collections of patents, but we can also take a tour. A guided tour in the Touch Art Gallery is an interactive multimedia experience. It is not a video. You can stop it and additional material will appear. And I'll show you a little bit about what such a tour looks like. It is based on the visual narratives of Ken Burns, who is a terrific
Alfred Nobel's inventions laid the foundation for many major industries. The patent royalties from these inventions and industries, along with corporate profits, also laid the foundation for his great fortune. Nobel did not work alone. 3 of his closest colleagues, Alaric Liedbeck, Georges Fehrenbach, and Ragnar Solman, were also remembered in his will. In a world of
So I can stop it. I get a little piece of information about the Panama Canal, which was built with using the dynamite invention.
Industries and transportation systems, there was a huge market for explosives. Explosives were crucial in mining and the building of railroads and other public works. Alfred Nobel's most important inventions all dealt with making nitroglycerin into a practical explosive. The largest difficulty in working with
So at any time I can pinch zoom in, can't do that with a video, get more information, possibly go to another tour and so on. You get the idea. We did the authoring using the authoring component, which is a nonlinear timeline-based editor. That's also been ported into our latest system called Dash. Not going to show any more of it. Those of you who've done timeline editors will not be surprised, but it's a very simplified one in that it requires no scripting. Everything is done with drop and drag and so on, and instant feedback. Let's go back to the slides. So a simple little hypermedia system, closed and to be used in kiosk mode only. It's still running. I think it's in India now. Well, again, answering Dick's question, when did this stuff finally become real, go outside of the research lab? I think if you think of terms of quantum leaps, HyperCard from Apple got us about a third of the way. It was the first time that hypertext had been popularized, that it was widely available on commodity equipment. It was a closed system, but for what it did, it was very pretty. It was beautifully engineered. One of my students did HyperTalk, which was the scripting language underneath it. It had quite a lot of power, but the metaphor of small cards just doesn't work for me. And so we used it, but we thought it's got a long way to go. Then came the web with all of its advantages and limitations, and we thank Sir Tim for getting us in the world of the first open universal hypertext system through pretty simple concepts. The modeling was very simple, but it was at scale. And that's the biggest advantage of the web, that it actually works at scale. Nobody had done that before. But a very important thing, all of us had this religion in the beginning that authors and readers were the same people, active reading. You read by highlighting, by annotating, by commenting on the original sources and other people's comments. That all disappeared. And Mosaic is part of the problem there. But the advantage is it's at scale, and I have to keep repeating that because we sometimes forget. And yeah, we can unite, connect the world's people, the world's knowledge generators through this particular invention, even with all of its limitations. Now, back in history a little bit, another place to have tribute to the people who made this commercialization happen rests on the invention of personal computing. We all know the Steve Jobs story, the history of the Mac. He came to Brown with Andy Hertzfeld, who was my student and learned graphics from me and who did the Finder and many other key components of the first Mac. And I was really impressed by that little box. But I showed him our network of Apollos with file servers. Apollo was the dominant workstation at the time, and we were the first people to invest in an electronic classroom filled with 40 of them. They had lots of memory for the time, 0.5 megabyte, file servers, print servers. The Xerox Palo Alto research model, we didn't invent that, and neither did Apollo. The implementation, yes, but the idea came out of Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, where the idea for the Mac also came from, just to make sure we all know that it didn't spring full-born from the head of Steve Jobs. He commercialized in a brilliant move. Anyhow, he came to Brown, and he said 128K, 2 floppy drives, or 1 floppy drive, that's it, personal computer. And I said, no, no, no. If you're going to sell this into a university, it's a productivity environment. They need to have a lot of data at their fingertips. They need file servers, they need print servers, you need a network, you need hard drives. No, 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 no. And we had a bitter fight in front of our provost, who had never seen an intellectual fight like that. And of course, he was wrong, and in this case, I was right. Xerox PARC had proven it 10 years earlier, right? I was hardly inventing anything. And so eventually, of course, we had Apple Talk and hard drives and all that stuff. So there were some missteps along the way, but still deserves enormous credit for the commoditization of this idea. Personal computers started way earlier. And the person who really helped commercialize, nobody knows him. We worked closely with him when we had our big IBM grant, was Don Estridge, who died in a plane crash and got the PC launched with all of its problems. It would have been a lot better had he lived. And then Gates, who saw very early the promise of personal computing, information at your fingertips. Now, where did this all come from? Again, early history. It came out of a societal trend, not just Moore's law and micro-miniaturization. That was the technology underpinning that made it possible, but it really was a social movement that influenced it a lot, and that was leveraged by people like Steve Jobs. In the 60s, we're commemorating the 50th anniversary, 30th of the Berlin Wall, 50th anniversary of revolts and rebellion, and lots of Sturm und Drang in European universities and American universities. I lived through all that. I saw it firsthand. It was a rebellion against hierarchy, against the man, as it was called in the States. Power to the people. That's really what it was about. Computer power to the people. Democratization. Information wants to be free. Sounds great, right? Well, it has a dark side, which we'll get to in a moment. If information wants to be free, how are you going to pay the bills? Belinda talked about this yesterday in her keynote. So this anti-establishment trend absolutely fueled the rise of interest in personal computing, which then led from hobbyists to commoditization. And yes, information wants to be free. Connectivity, great. We have these giants today. And at the end of my talk, I'll say, yeah, but we lost a lot and we are paying a price. Monopoly powers in particular. So, yes, we have wonderful accessibility. We do have information at our fingertips. We have good productivity tools. But this flood of information that we started off with as the problem, again, Belinda's keynote yesterday, it's overwhelming and there's more crap out there than ever. And how do we know what is the good stuff and what isn't? Most stuff is uncurated. We don't know whom we can trust for what kind of information. And as we all know, too much mis and disinformation. So yes, we've had this democratization that the social movements of the 60s wanted us to have, but we have many unintended consequences. It's all about ad revenue, advertisement revenue. Journalists are being replaced by bots. There's a tremendous loss of good journalism at this point, and they are even in physical danger. That's a whole other thing that we won't talk about. Newsprint is going away. We've seen it coming for a long time, and there are many downsides to that. In particular, newspapers, if there is a surviving one, may or may not have the staff to report local news, and so there are places that don't have newspapers, in the US at least, and there is no way for people to get local news anymore. It's really a problem. If we look at hypertext and ask ourselves, where is it? Well, it's here. The World Wide Web exists, and it's about hypertext, but it's the lowest common denominator kind of hypertext. You all know about it. I don't need to talk about it. I've listed a bunch of issues here. I don't have time to talk about them. You are quite familiar with them. The one at the bottom I'll just mention, authoring, which was a fundamental part of every system built in the 60s and 70s, is now something specialists do, and they do it by programming. The authoring tools have largely disappeared. Linking is pretty much an afterthought. You can't visualize the directed graphs. Annotation, the way we thought of it as an integral part of every system, is very difficult to do unless you use external things. So it's not perfect. It has huge advantages. It has major disadvantages that this community should continue to address. I'm going to give you my set of what I think are engaging and enduring research issues. Now, this field is unique in terms of my experiences in having keynoters ask rhetorically, what are the important research issues, and making a list of them. I think I started this in my 87 keynote, and I was followed by lots of other wonderful people. Here is my list. In computer graphics, which is really the field I've spent most of my life in, we've had exactly 2 papers that listed the outstanding problems in computer graphics as a research agenda, whereas in this community, we do it over and over again, and we revisit that list and update it. And I think that's a wonderful tradition. So here's my list. Halash, a great thinker in this field, came up with his 7. Norm, with whom I started Iris and who led the intermediate team, has written extensively and has keynoted extensively. Halash again, revisiting. Shipman, who worked with Kathy Marshall on the first ideation about spatiality and spatial hypertext, has a very good one. Paul Lebrun, who's not here, is that right? Yeah, I'm sad not to have met him. Focusing on personalization. And here's his list. And then Shipman again. And some more Halash revisiting. And read them sequentially through time. They are still illuminating. That's why I thanked Klaus for dragging me into this, because I got to reread some of this old stuff. Really good. All right, here is my list. And you should feel free to disagree with it, pick and choose. We can do things to fix the web. That's a whole set of research issues, getting standards for annotation, actual region-to-region linking across media, not just within text, but to regions on frames of videos, which we can do in the system we're building and in previous system, and other people have done it. Better visualization and so on. Structure remains an enduring issue in our community. Different forms of structure, trying to understand what the implications are and how you create design patterns for building them. Computing over structures and other things. It's such an interesting idea that Mark started us off with. Have a very complex set of relationships and then whittle them down to the ones that are essential. Forgive me if I am summarizing in a terrible way. You can correct me. And design patterns, which we learn to think about through object-oriented programming, but which I thought about even back then based on what Nelson did in the design pattern that he used for the patent database. Navigation remains an outstanding problem. How do you not get lost? How do you do this trail building that Bush forecast we would be doing? We don't do it for all practical purposes. We have branch points where you can choose to go to a digression or a clarification or an expansion, but we don't have much in the way of example trails of a major sort. Elision. Search. I just want to talk for a moment about search. It's great. It works really well, but it's so primitive still. We don't do structural search, even though people have been writing about it for years. It's very hard to do. Search has, to a very large extent, become the implicit linking mechanism to avoid having to build hard links. But I see them as completely complementary. We're not going to give up links in our Wikipedia pages or other hypertext that we build, and we're going to use that together with search. They augment each other. And searching has gotten to be very good, based a lot on machine learning. Another one of my former students, Peter Norvig, Director of Research at Google, wrote this very good paper on why this stuff works. Big data lets us do really good searching, but it's still in the infancy. I can't give a sort of arbitrary search where I say, find me the article by the first person who thought about spatial hypertext. She didn't have an example system. I think she came from California, and it might have been in the 70s or 80s. That's something you can say to a human assistant, a graduate student or undergraduate you're working with. It's an ill-specified search in a natural language, and there's no way you can give that to a system these days and have it understand that. The notion of change, things that evolve, things that adapt. We've had lots of fine examples, Mark's Guard Fields and the work on adaptive hypertext. We did some of that ourselves with the Sonar Repair Manual. I have a lot of faith in the area of agents, even though I haven't seen any good implementations of it. So agents can help you find stuff, but more importantly, when they find things, they can do computational processes over them, put them in an appropriate place with appropriate formatting in a spatial collection, for example. And you can think of them in the primitive form as scripts that you run asynchronously or synchronously. Dick and his group and some other people have worked a completely separate problem that is still vital today, and I hope he'll talk a little bit about that in his after-dinner speech. Time-based media, temporal dimension. It isn't just the spatial dimension. Very important. We've done very little work on it, and he and his group are the experts in that. Now, here's the commercial that sort of part of the conference motto or theme. Engelbart talked about augmenting human intellect. I want augmentation, but I also want automation where it's appropriate. I want processes to run, these agents that run at my behest in background. Again, Mark has written about this. We've built a simple little recommender system that is, you can think of it as augmentation, you can think of it as automation. I want human in the loop interaction with the machine doing the things that I can specify algorithmically, and with me doing things that it can't yet do for me. In terms of implementation, there's still a lot of systems research issues that deal with layers of abstraction, as in the Amsterdam hypertext model, open systems, component-based systems. Wendy and her Southampton crew, amply represented here, I understand, did pioneering work on that notion already in the early 90s. And even today, we continue to wrestle with interoperability problems. And I hope I'll have a chance to talk just a little bit about that. Okay, I'm going to cut out the playing of the Agent Knowledge Navigator video. You absolutely need to watch that. It's a concept video that was commissioned to sort of show what computing of the future might look like in the 80s when John Sculley was running Apple after he ousted Steve Jobs. It is still a beautiful example of what we want in an intelligent assistant. We don't have any intelligence in today's so-called smart devices. I can give you lots of examples of where you change the word order just slightly and Alexa or Google Home don't know what you're talking about. They're very, very primitive, and that's because they have no common sense reasoning. They just strip language out of your request and try to do pattern matching, which is what machine learning is all about. Let's make sure we all agree on this fundamental principle. AI isn't machine learning. Machine learning is a very hugely important component of AI, but AI has to represent knowledge at some point. And that's the part that's missing. We do great at pattern recognition. We're still lousy at knowledge representation and inferencing. And unfortunately, that has taken a kind of backseat in AI research because machine learning lets you do so many really cool things almost trivially. Okay, I'm going to do just a little bit on the system we're currently working on. And I have to hurry up. Dick says he's right. Dash, it's called Dash for Dashboard. Again, I want to address the problem of authoring. It's very hard work to make a good hypertext. And I've come to the awful realization that I'm going to retire without ever having built a graphics textbook that is a hypertext, for example. I've done lots of print media books, but no hypertext one. And the realization is that that's a multidisciplinary activity. And we don't have critical mass in teams to build that. Game designers do. They'll have 20 to 40 people ranging across a spectrum of capabilities to help the author create the game. And it costs $20 million to $100 million to develop a game. Whenever was there that kind of money to do that for building hypertext? Again, something that Wendy hit on yesterday and in the Q&A that came out. Where's the money that supports that kind of work? So all we can do is, again, go back to the notion of build easy-to-use authoring systems. Our system can be thought of as an interactive development environment. It supports standard stuff that you know about. So we do support simple node link, spatial navigation, and it's kind of a smarter desktop where you can connect things that are connected together. It's bidirectional, region to region, full text searching, and we're driving it with a number of use cases. I'll play you about 6 minutes worth of video, and then I'll go to the tail end of this talk. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay, I was allotted an hour and 15 minutes, and we started at quarter off. Okay, going to do just a little bit on Dash, and then we'll do the segue. Thank you, boss. So, I'm still in the research business. I want to use my hypermedia system for organizing my materials and creating new content. So, here's my collaborator, without whom I could have not done the research or build the presentation. She's been working with me for 2 decades. And why am I? There we go. Sorry. So, homage to Rosemary.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Simpson, and I'm creating a 2D Dash workspace that uses a spatial layout to provide a more natural overview of spatial hypertext documents than a linear web page could. The purpose of this workspace is threefold: to help clarify the history and ongoing nature of spatial hypertext, to provide an exploration space that can evolve from its current minimalist state, and 3, to become part of a much fuller treatment of hypertext history, concepts, and current state, which we plan to use in a seminar on hypertext next fall here at Brown. The workspace has 2 major subject divisions. Each subject consists of collections of scrollable PDFs, images, annotations, and both direct and indirect forms of linking. The main subject division addresses the motivations, computer support, and research issues content for spatial hypertext domain. The subsidiary division contains collections of relevant projects and people. Names that lead to actual collections, not just placeholders for future collections, are in dark green in color. The spatial hypertext domain has 3 collections structured as portals, each leading to a large evolving information space. The visual appearance of a portal is like the cover of a book and typically has a brief abstract and a representative image. Color helps to differentiate the portals. Portals may be linked to other documents in a network graph structure. They also provide hierarchy for managing the structural complexity of a contained collection. Clicking on the portal cover opens the portal, providing access to the collection within. In this case, we see a collection of PDF documents about computer support for spatial hypertext. Attached to each document are annotations that summarize some of the importance and information in that document. In addition, we have some diagrams that show various aspects of computer support for spatial hypertext. Going back to the spatial hypertext overview, the people and project collection.
Okay, I'll summarize so I can try to get to the last portion of my talk. Spatial layout, hierarchies of containers, links, powerful searching both within the database. Everything in the database is a document. As a first-class citizen, documents have metadata, system provided and explicitly authored, so that links are searchable. You can have links to links. Regions are documents, so you can search for them. You can annotate PDFs. You can write different kinds of comments on PDFs. You can link from a PDF to a region on a frame in a video and all that. Let me go past all that. I have a bunch of use cases dealing with photos, for example, and I would be delighted to show that to you. We are cross-platform. We are kind of a component-based open hypertext system. One of the key messages that I want to leave you with today is this notion that when you build a hypertext system, you want it to operate within the larger ecosystem in which you are embedded. But this continues to be an exceedingly frustrating task because the APIs designed in the Office suite or the Google suite weren't meant for this free exchange of information. And because of privacy rules and third-party access to information, cross-origin resource sharing, that system, often you're frustrated when you're trying to get information of somebody else's server and you can't import it and annotate it and link it in. Interoperability is a mess still today, and I see it unendingly. It's a serious problem. Okay. Topic switch. Again, come up to me in break, and I'll show these videos of our system aborting. I'm also going to make the system available to any of you. We're going to build out this database of early hypertext history, and I would love for you to be able to play with it. There will be a release sometime this calendar year with all of this stuff in there. I have become really engrossed in the societal implications of our field and where this information access story is going and what it has done. We have this explosion of accessibility and social media. And the good part is it's easy to have a quilters group and against nuclear energy group and breast cancer support groups and so on. It's wonderful. And Twitter has definitely been useful in countries where all other communication media have been shut down for political or other reasons. But there are a lot of negative side effects. And I say, to quote our countryman Edska Dijkstra, social media are considered harmful. That's not to say they don't have their role. Don't hear me as saying we shouldn't have social media. I'm just trying to re-emphasize some of the things you guys know very well from my point of view. Privacy, and especially the weaponization, as it was called explicitly by Cambridge Analytica, who were an arms provider before they became a digital weapons provider. Weaponization of information and misinformation. Photography, using our tools from computer graphics and image processing to create things that don't exist, like deep fakes, photos, videos of things and people that never happened. And we have the hacking of democracy, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So what I'm saying is we need to think about ethics in the work we are doing. And Bill Buxton exposed me to the work of this sociologist who studied the impact of technology on society and got me away from what I believed all my life and taught thousands of students. Hey, technology is neutral. You can use it for good or bad. No, he says, it is not neutral. And you can't take that stance and say it's somebody else's problem to worry about how this affects society. So here's a reference to what he was written. We were techno-optimists in the 60s and 70s and 80s. We had these visions of how the world of information access would evolve, and we never thought about the downsides. Now we do. And in particular, an attitude that is still prevalent in our field, we're just tool builders. We create them and how other people use them, that's not our problem. Absolutely wrong. Part of it is because we created this Faustian bargain. This is the land of Goethe's Faust. It was my favorite course in college, translating pieces of that incredible poetry. And there's a lot of science in Faust, too. I wrote my best paper ever on the use of light imagery in Faust, based on his understanding of the Farbenlehre, color theory. Anyhow, we've given them our data, and they're monetizing it. Surveillance capitalism. I'll talk more about that. I was very influenced by these 3 books. These are must-buy books for any technologist working in this area, because it explains things in much greater depth than you get out of the online and print media sources. Roger McNamee was an early supporter of Facebook. He got them Sheryl Sandberg. He was a great fan, and he is now bitterly opposed to what Facebook has allowed to happen, and he details it in this book. Mark, who read my slides and gave me useful feedback, told me about this article, which I hadn't even heard about, A Villain's Guide to Social Media and Web Science, which is a slightly different point of view, but also talks about the misuse of technology. I'm going to talk about 4 things. You all know about them, and you may find some of my references useful. Addiction, attention as the commodity. They want us to be hooked on screens, so that we'll be exposed to more ads. More click-throughs means more ad revenue. That's what the model is based on. And this is a really good TED Talk. It's based on deep research that has been conducted on how you cause addiction, how you get people to lose more money playing poker or pinball. The gaming industry is a huge industry, and they hook people by doing things to our brains. It's an influence on brain chemistry. Violent video games do the same thing. It started with Skinnerian behaviorism, and I studied that in college. And it's fascinating to see how you go from operant conditioning, starting with Pavlov's experiments with dogs, all the way to how you cause addiction in people. There are labs that specialize in this. It's all about increasing dopamine levels in our brain through these various mechanisms like color and sound and rewards. And queue up the next video on the same subject. So yes, I love recommender systems and affinity groups for what they do, but even I get hooked on, oh yeah, there's yet one more YouTube video on somebody doing jazz improv in a train station. And one day while I was working on these slides, I got hooked for an hour looking at video after video of these amazing musicians. In kids that we teach, especially, the fear of missing out. for teenagers. This is a terrible problem, social insecurity, constantly needing approval. And everybody is on screens all the time and wants instant feedback. If you don't respond, you feel guilty because you're neglecting your buddies, your friends, and you're not getting the positive feedback that you want. This article, Teens Explains the World of Snapchat Streaks. You guys know what streaks are? How many? Most do not. Okay, here's the simple idea. Snap is a social media company. You can send pictures around, and you get rewarded for the number of times you post and how fast you respond. And if you keep doing that in a faster and faster cycle, that's a streak. It's all about approval in adolescence. And friendships live or die by the degree to which you are respected by your peers. It's ghastly. So what we find with our students is that they increasingly live in the online or virtual world where they know how to interact, and it's not a good interaction most of the time. It degenerates ever so quickly. And they also get their news. I asked my class of 400 people how many of them read newspapers. Forget about it. 10 out of the 400, online or offline. Where do they get it? From social media channels that aggregate, condense, package, and customize it to just you based on your behaviors. Twitter, Google News, and people don't even realize that they're seeing what the algorithms and the ads that they have clicked on tell them they should be seeing. Most of the content that is presented as news is stolen from legitimate news media, and there's a big battle now between, say, the New York Times and the Washington Post and Google and Facebook about how they get compensated for their content. Filter bubbles where you only get the news personalized to you based on your psychographic profile, and you don't get any opposing points of view. We had a lovely conversation, Klaus and I, about the attention span problem of our students. I call this butterflying. You quickly read the first page of a Wikipedia article, and there are these links, and you click on them. 5 seconds, you're back, read some more. 5 seconds, check Facebook to see if anything new has come in, or go someplace else. And you keep multitasking and switching your attention. That's butterflying, and it means that we are getting worse and worse about linear reading. You are being merchandised through your psychographic profile. I just recently saw this video from Netflix, The Great Hack. It is scary as hell because it tells you exactly how they went about winning the election for Trump, and not just that election, but as you know, there's a huge influence on the Brexit vote, the Brazil election, and so on and so forth. Here's the problem. 30K data points aggregated by Facebook on most of the people in the US, not based necessarily on their Facebook activities. They aggregate and do data fusion from all of the other information that they get from all other sources. What you buy using your credit cards, where you Google, and so on and so forth. And I have not been able to find out what these data points are and how they are collected and data fused and how I get rid of that record. Google has a little bit in being able to erase your search history, for example, but you never can find out what all they know about you. What is the definition of a data point? Somebody ought to be studying this. Okay, guys, we are being manipulated. Propaganda. The book was written by Freud's nephew in 1928. Propaganda used by Stalin and the communists to incredibly good effect, by the Nazis. On and on through society today, the benign form was advertisements, which was written about in the 50s. We're being manipulated into buying, and you might say, Yeah, I ignore ad. I'm not really subject to that. But there are lots of ways in which all of us even become addicted to what we get out of screens and the micro-targeting that can be done with all this data that has been aggregated about us. It's about behavior modification. It's not just the benign collection of information. That information is being weaponized. Filter bubbles, biases are reinforced, and you basically go for lowest common denominator in human behavior. The nasty stuff that you see on the web, to me, is still shocking. I cannot get used to how nasty people are when they flame each other, even in professional circles. Here's a point I didn't know until I read about it very recently. I always believed in a rational world where you hold a certain belief based on some things you've learned, and then somebody shows you some contrary evidence, and you say thoughtfully, that's interesting. Maybe I shouldn't be so dug in. Not so. In the real world, negative reinforcement doesn't work. You believe even more in what you were told in your filter bubble when somebody presents you with contrary evidence. Study after study proves it, that people dig in to their pre-held beliefs when challenged. I love this story that I just got the other day. Fake news, bots posing as people. Nearly half of Donald Trump's Twitter followers are fake accounts. But the news is cited. So democracy has been hacked. We have a terrible problem with anti-vax people in the US, and I think the UK too. I don't know how it's in Europe. So we have epidemics now of whooping cough and measles in schools because parents have read that vaccines are not safe. So it's not just about elections, which affect leadership, but it's about things close to home. Is your kid going to have a problem from somebody who has not been vaccinated? Tribalism. Surveillance capitalism, it's about the money. This is a deep book, Shoshana Zuboff's. Takes time to read it, but it tells you where laissez-faire economics and this data-dependent economy has taken us. It's really going to be hard to get away from that. We've created this golem or Frankenstein, but we're now addicted through the companies that are addicted to their growth and their wealth. And the old slogan that we liked for a while, move fast and break things, is breaking society at this point. They have a monopoly. Zuckerberg has the controlling interest by himself in Facebook, and Facebook has 2.7 billion users. And what he says goes. He has more power in many ways than the US president. That's shocking. That's not a... In this particular case, that may or may not be a bad thing. Yes, I understand your point. But the regime of Zuckerberg as czar is a terrible regime. Personal opinion, you can fight me on it in the breaks. Deny, deflect, dissemble, and then just apologize, and maybe something will happen and something will not. So I really love what Europe is doing in this area. It is way ahead of the US and Asia. GDPR, here's one of your heroines. But interestingly, everything has an unintended consequence. I just 2 days ago talked to one of my former students who's a Google employee working in the ad space, but with the social impact of the ads as part of his group's charter. And he says the lawyers now are being so strict about how we can use data that we now have these tremendously complex policies about cookies and how they're kept and how you get rid of them. The consequence has been that it's harder for people now to navigate this than it used to be because of all the legal stuff. I think this is a great thing. The attorney generals have gotten together. Each state in the US has an attorney general, and then districts also do. And they're saying, these guys have monopoly power. And they violate our data privacy all the time. we need to look at this. Plus, they own everything they can buy because they have so much money, so they can put anybody out of business with their strategies and erect barriers to entry. Here's what I'm going for: humane design, humane computing. Thinking about ethics in technology is not new, as Mark reminded me again. If you want to think about technology and AI, and there's a whole section which I'm not going to go over about how the people in AI are really at the forefront now of thinking about the ethics of their field, even before problems arise. But it's as old as the philosophers thinking about ethics, and in terms of technology, Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. It's a big field. I'm going to skip all over this and go to the conclusion. Yes, David and Dick, I'm finally winding up. My call to arms. Let's try to minimize our screen usage. Turn our damn phones off when we go into a restaurant. It's hard. Get on board with attacking the big companies, subscription versus advertisement. Be willing to pay for trusted point of view rather than trying to get it for free. Music shows us some of the way. Freedom of expression shouldn't be absolute, but how do we write the rules of governance? How do we inform a Mark Zuckerberg about how his company ought to deal with violent videos online, the New Zealand problem? These are very tough problems, and I'm not looking for an instant solution. There isn't one. But let's at least have them spend the money, a third of what they earn, on trying to figure out how to deal with these social consequences, rather than just continuously emphasizing growth for its own sake because of the cash it brings in. Let's help educate our students and lobby for ethical behavior. Humane design, where whatever project you're engaged in, you think a priori about the intended social consequences and try to head off the negative, unanticipated consequences. Goes far beyond accessibility design that we've learned to do in user interface design. Again, this center. And the notion that you have a choice on what you work on and how you influence that project in terms of goals. This is my wrap-up slide. Let's go back to Engelbart's grand vision, augmenting human intelligence. I think the glass is half full. You can be an optimist one day and a pessimist the next day, or switch between those two polar opposites within the space of 30 seconds. The tech hasn't gone nearly as far as we thought it would in 1968, despite our smartphones. It's pretty good, but it still has a lot of problems. We certainly have not augmented human intellect with our tools. Each of us can benefit from productivity tools, but are we better decision makers than we were in the 60s? Certainly our political leadership is not. We're going backwards in some way with this harmful effects of social media. So let us be responsible, teach our students and our colleagues to be responsible, and together fix this, because we're just at the beginning, folks. It's still early days. Apologies for running over. Happy to have, if Klaus and David permit me, a few questions, or you can stop, whatever you like. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Wow, that's great feedback.
Yeah, thank you very
so
much. Thank you very much for taking the long view and taking us right the way from those early visions to some of the concerns I think we've seen reflected in other presentations at the conference as well. I think after a talk like that, it would be criminal not to allow at least a few questions. Yes, we are running a little bit late, but I would still like to take some questions from the floor. If we can, I'd like to use the microphone. I think I've got one here. Daniel has one on the other side as well. So Yeah.
Again, thanks for helping me navigate, Daniel.
So, questions? Right. It's for the live stream. So.
I think one of the interesting things right from the beginning is you're talking about the kind of anti-authoritarian, countercultural roots philosophically that we find with some of the kind of early pioneers. And then towards the end, we're talking about the benefits of regulation and the advantages of kind of large government organizations imposing themselves into these kind of areas. So do you think there's a way that we can create a kind of new philosophy or a new ideology, particularly within this kind of community, which encourages that kind of collaboration with government rather than maybe where the roots are, which is a kind of rejection of the imposition of regulation and the kind of free market thinking which came to dominate in the 1990s?
Yes, okay. You raise a very complex set of intertwined issues. Here's my take on it. We're at the very beginning of learning as technologists how we can influence our politicians. They know nothing about computer technology. To a first approximation, there are maybe 3 scientists in all of US Congress, and none of them are information technologists. We have one IT guy running for president. He doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell. So we should help educate our government officials, and we should take an interest in what they do, and we should call our politicians and try to influence them to be concerned about laws for data privacy and for how we deal with free speech, which is one pole, versus not allowing pedophiles and people preaching the violent overthrow of government, racists, anti-feminists, whatever brand of extremism you don't want. How do we deal with that? You need teams of sociologists, ethnography people, technologists, politicians working together, and we hardly see that. Dana Boyd, whom I mentioned, who has her roots in technology and then did sociology for her PhD and understands these influences, is very sought after as an advisor and speaker because she combined so many of these skills, and she's running a big center that deals with some of these problems in New York for Microsoft. But she's an exception of somebody who is multicultural, shall we say, and has the command of that space. I sure as hell don't. So I think we have to learn more about these adjacent disciplines and have more conversations with people who can influence things. Do I like the idea of government having to step in and regulate Google and Facebook? I don't. I don't have that much trust in government, frankly, especially not our current government. Separate issue. But the fact is, they're not going to do it by themselves. They are not going to police themselves. They are going to push the envelope as much as they can to make money. And then if they have to back off a little so that they don't get sued and have to pay too many fines, they'll do that. But of their own volition, they won't do it, so we need to have government step in. I wish it weren't so. Sorry, I don't know whether I answered your question.
Any others? Mark?
In your Hypertext 87 keynote, one of your research agendas was the link considered as go-to. But as the author of Hypertext Patterns, we haven't even got control structures. That hasn't worked. We certainly don't have objects. And I've been sitting here musing about functional hypertext. And yes, exactly. So where are we, and where do we proceed with that part of the agenda?
I don't know. We have hardwired links, but we also have sort of Twitter-like tags where you don't say from here to here. You specify a tag that you know, and it builds the link for you. We have recommender software. So we're not married to hard links, but regardless of how you create them, you're still going to have spaghetti. And what you want is some kind of overview. So one of the research problems that I mentioned, which we are working on, is just some degree of elision and summarization, which you get very nicely out of spatial hypertext when you have hierarchical containers. And you can get elision of text itself, which we have, kind of a primitive version of TED's stretch text, where you can take an entire section of text and just substitute a keyword for it, expand it, and then you get the full text, or you can go to an annotation. So we're playing around with different kinds of structures, but anything that imposes the kind of discipline of controlled flow of control that we have in object-oriented programming, let alone functional programming, we still don't have. So keep working on useful patterns and show them by example. Sorry.
So I think probably we have time for one final question, if anyone has anything else they would like to raise.
Pardon?
Over coffee. Yeah,
absolutely.
Time. Klaus, I believe you wanted to say a few words, but perhaps, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. I could have listened another hour to your keynote
no,
speech.
No, you couldn't. Not without a lot of coffee.
Yeah, we will have coffee soon. So we were thinking about what can we give you as a thank you, as a present for having this keynote, which we all very much appreciate, since it's a perfect match to our 30th anniversary conference. So we thought, well, we could give you something you can think of or think about or remember this conference, which is our conference
T-shirt.
T-shirt.
Oh, thank you, Klaus. Nice logo. Yeah, very good.
You will wear it.
I will wear it in the summer.
Perfect. Okay.
Not today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on my soapbox. I appreciate that.
I look forward to seeing you wearing it on YouTube in the short future. Just a quick announcement before we finish. We're going into the coffee break and poster session. I think we decided that we would put both of those together. So there are coffees outside. The poster room is upstairs. I believe we have 12 posters. They're there for the duration of the conference. But if I could ask the authors of those posters to make sure you're up there for this coming session, then that means that other people can find you and talk to you about your work. And the next proper sort of formal paper session, I guess, will start at 11:30. But we have an excellent set of posters, so I'd really encourage you to go and engage with those people. So perhaps we could one final moment of appreciation as well. Oh, yeah. So thank you, Andy, very much.
If I may ask you all to go outside.